Hi, and welcome back to lecture number 68. Today we're talking about the Great Depression. Our theme for today is work, exchange, and technology. Only one learning objective, that is, explain the causes of the Great Depression and its effects on the economy. So the United States at this point is still continuing its transition from a rural agricultural economy to an urban industrial economy led by large companies. In previous lectures, we've talked about how the 1920 census showed that for the first time, there were more Americans living in cities or in urban areas than in rural areas. The agricultural economy up until this point had been aided by World War I, but as soon as the war ended and American farmers were no longer feeding people in Europe, that demand went down. And with lower demand came lower prices. And so farmers to the 1920s were struggling. So they were not doing as well. They were not enjoying the same type of prosperity that people in the cities were enjoying. We have overfarming and drought in the Great Plains, and that's going to create conditions for the Dust Bowl. The map on the top left kind of shows you where the Dust Bowl was at its worst, where the soil erosion was worse, and you could see how it was so fine and so thin that it would look like sand, and then as soon as windstorms would come up, it would pick up that dust and that sand, and it would blow it to other parts of the Great Plains. And then as soon as that eroded soil landed in other areas, it diminished the quality of the soil in other parts of the country, kind of carrying that those difficult farming conditions to other areas. On the bottom left, you see what it's like to be actually inside one of those dust storms where the visibility is quite low. And part of this is going to be one of the push factors for why people in the Great Plains are moving to other areas of the country, mainly California. So Okies, people from Oklahoma who had to move because they couldn't live in the farms anymore because they weren't financially viable, are called Okies, and they begin a migration to the West Coast. So this is a famous picture on the top right by photographer Dorothea Lange of people from Oklahoma who were on their path and kind of migrating, trying to take jobs, agricultural jobs, as they became available on the road. The urban industrial economy during the 1920s was relatively strong, even though there were some weaknesses in the foundations of that prosperity. So the factory system would continue through the 1920s, but it was adding to the wealth gap. So the people who own the factories would continue to make more money, and the people who were working in the factories were not getting any raises during the 1920s. So union membership was declining in the 1920s. They weren't very popular, and because unions weren't active, they weren't able to get wage increases for their workers. Additionally, American consumers are becoming more comfortable using credits to purchase goods. They overextend themselves and are having to pay off these debts for a long period of time. So everyone wanted a car, everyone wanted a washing machine, everyone wanted a refrigerator, and because there were financing plans to buy those products, people took those opportunities and then just paid them off over time. The factories continued to produce those goods even as there were fewer consumers out there to buy the new products. There was an attempt at trying to get Europeans to buy those products, but when the government starts to implement protective tariffs to protect factories at home from competition from abroad, it's going to spur retaliatory tariffs from other countries. So European countries start to erect protective barriers or protective tariffs against American products outselling European products. And so it's making those American products more expensive abroad, which is leading to lower sales for American companies. So that's going to lead to some financial troubles. And then finally, we have the rise in the stock market speculation. So everyone was able to invest into the stock market, buy equity in certain companies. And it turned out that people were buying equity in companies despite some of those companies not actually doing well, not actually making a lot of money. So it created a huge bubble where companies were being sold for a price that they were not actually worth. To make matters worse, there was an increase in buying on margin. So this means that investors could put down a small percentage of the amount of stock that they wanted to buy, and then a bank would cover the rest of the cost of the trade or of the purchase of the stock. And the bank would get its money whenever the person would sell that stock, and they would share in the profits. So the bank would get its money back plus some interest. Well, what's going to happen is that the stock market's going to crash, and then everyone who had money tied up with the stock market is not going to be able to get that money back to repay their debts or their loans. So episodes of credit and market instability in the early 20th century, in particular the Great Depression, led to calls for a stronger financial regulatory system. The credit and market instability that we talk about is the stock market crash, which happened on October 29th, 1929, and that's often referred to as Black Tuesday. And after the stock market crashed, the banks that had money tied up in the stock market no longer had enough money in their vaults to cover the savings and the checking accounts of normal consumers. Then, as consumers became wary that the banks no longer had money in their vaults or would soon run out of money in their vaults, it would lead to bank runs. So people would literally run to the bank, line up outside, and try to withdraw all of their money, so that way when the bank ran out, they would still have their money. The Great Depression was spurred by the stock market crash. It led to a domino effect of other financial institutions crashing down. The banking institutions, or the banking system, was one of those, because even though not all of the banks in the United States were putting money into the stock market, the perception was that most banks in the U.S. would fail. And so banks that were relatively solvent, that means that they had enough money in their vaults to cover their daily business, still experienced bank runs, which caused them to fail. So it was a self-fulfilling prophecy due to the fear that the bank would fail. This leads to a 25% unemployment at the worst part of the Great Depression. GNP, that's gross national product, goes down 50%, and about 20% of all of the banks in the United States will close. President Hoover, who was elected in 1928, because of his supposed financial ability that he showed during World War I, is ultimately blamed for this, because he doesn't really do anything to make the Depression or the effects of the Depression better. As shanty towns were popping up all across the country, as seen in the bottom right, they became called Hoovervilles. People who would turn out the pockets of their pants to show that they had no money inside of them, they would call those Hoover flags. People sleeping on the ground or sleeping outside with newspaper to cover themselves they would be said to be using Hoover blankets. And then people using cars with the engine taken out and being pulled by a horse would be called driving their Hoover wagons. So you can see that the Great Depression and its effect becomes very closely associated with President Hoover, even though he didn't really do anything that would have led to the spark of the Great Depression. But it was his lack of inaction that gets his name associated with the worst parts of the Depression. So towards the end of his presidency, Hoover does something to lessen the effects of the Depression, but it is normally seen as doing too little too late. So it took President Hoover quite a long time to really do anything about the Depression, and this is even after there were several marches, like the marches of the Bonus Army on Washington, to get the government to provide some sort of relief. Now, the Bonus Army were World War I veterans who had been promised a bonus for their service in the Army during World War I, but it wasn't going to be paid out until later on in the 1930s, late 1930s. Since the Depression was so bad, these veterans got together, marched on Washington to try and convince Congress to pay out the bonuses early and provide some relief for the veterans and their families. Now, the two agencies that the Hoover administration put in place, again, are seen as doing too little too late. The first one was meant to help farmers. The Federal Farm Board attempted to stabilize crop prices by holding the crops in government or cooperative owned grain elevators. And the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was basically propping up railroads, banks, life insurance companies, other financial institutions that were in trouble to try and reinstate some confidence in the financial system. And the hope was that if those agencies or those companies continue to do business, that there would be a multiplying effect, or that there would be a trickle-down effect for everyone who worked or would benefit from those services. So under FDR's presidency, so he will be elected in 1932, there are going to be more regulations put in place. The Emergency Banking Act closed all of the banks in the country, and then it allowed the federal government to judge whether a bank was solvent enough. So that means whether or not it had enough money in its vault to open up its doors. If it did not have enough money, then the fear was that people would rush to the bank again and try to withdraw all of their funds, making that bank fail. But if the government gives its approval and for that bank to reopen, then people will have confidence and a bank run will be avoided. The Glass-Steagall Act was legislation that prevented banks from investing money in the stock market or any other type of risky investments. The Securities and Exchange Commission will regulate Wall Street. This is still a commission or an agency that is in place today. They make sure that there is no fraud in stock exchange or on Wall Street. And the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Board is getting the federal government more involved in labor issues and in business. So it implements a minimum wage, a max amount of working hours, and it ends child labor using Congress's interstate commerce powers from the Constitution. All right. During the 1930s, policymakers responded to the mass unemployment and social upheavals of the Great Depression by transforming the U.S. into a limited welfare state, redefining the goals and ideas of modern American liberalism. So this is going to come mostly under FDR's presidency. One of the things that's created that leads to this new modern welfare state is the creation of the safety net of the Social Security Act. So Social Security is a national pension system. As people work, they are taxed and money goes into a trust. And that trust is paying people who are 65 and older every month in proportion to the amount of money that they've put in. The idea is that as workers that are paying into the system now, when they retire, they will also have others paying into the trust so that they can withdraw their Social Security. It also adds unemployment compensation, but when it was instituted, there was some resistance because people thought that it was one step closer towards socialism. So they saw the federal government as being too pro-union and increasing regulations on business, or using a lot of money using a lot of money that the government doesn't have to pay for these large programs. So that's called deficit spending. All right, and finally for a recap, the U.S. continues to become more urban. The stock market crash was the catalyst for the Great Depression. President Hoover was largely blamed for the Depression for his lack of action after the stock market crash. And finally, the policies and programs in FDR's New Deal will build the foundation for a limited welfare state. All right, I hope that you come back for the next lecture in which we will go further, deeper into FDR's New Deal. I hope that you come back for that one. I'll see you then.